have persisted, but have changed the way in which subsequent office holders of both parties have had to deal with these issues. And so the fundamental question I was trying to shed some light on is, why do some policy reforms take hold and others fade away after enactment? And so what I want to do in the remainder of my talk is define reform. What do I mean by reform? I want to talk about the theoretical framework I used. Then I want to spend a little bit of time looking at one particularly interesting case, U.S. airline deregulation, and draw some comparisons and contrasts, and then wrap up and leave some time for some dialogue. Okay, what do I mean by policy reform? Well, there are many different definitions of policy reform, and I certainly wouldn't say that mine is the only or the best, but it was important in my book to have one kind of concept of what I meant by that. And by policy reform, I meant a deliberate, non-incremental change in an existing line of policymaking intended to impart instrumental rationality on governmental activity, to make it more rational, or to distribute benefits to some broad constituency. So this is an effort to make government more effective, to make government work better, to create a more logical relationship between the policy tools that are used and the intended goals, and to make sure that government works for the broad majority, not simply benefit some narrow constituency. And so it's very important here to acknowledge that what I'm talking about are not breakthrough policies, where government is somehow penetrating a previously unoccupied field for the first time, where there was no government activity. That's a very different challenge. Maybe there was some scope of private sector activity where government had never had a role, and there was a question about whether government should be involved at all, and to try to make the case that this is an area of legitimate scope of public policy is an important challenge. Rather, what I was trying to look at in my case was literally reform, to form again, an area where government is involved. There was an acknowledgement that government should be involved in some public policy arena, but there was also a perception that its role was not as efficient and effective and equitable as it should be. And so the task is to reform it, to make it better. And indeed, in an era of big government and a modern welfare regulatory administrative state, most of what government does today in the year 2010 is involving reform, right? There aren't so many areas where we have completely barren policy terrain. And what we need to remember, and this is particularly true in the United States, and that is that reform of fields well populated by pre-existing public or private arrangements are going to often encounter resistance from existing stakeholders who like the existing arrangements or have adapted themselves to it. And so that's one reason why reform is very hard. We are not simply changing government's goals, we are trying to change the way in which actors in the state, in the private sector, businesses, families, individuals, organizations, how they operate too. And so we need to distinguish then between two phases of reform. The first phase is the enactment phase, which is, as we know, extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. And nothing here, I do not mean to denigrate how hard it is to reform things, to get reforms adopted in the first place. And we know something about the kind of characteristics and features that are required to make reform possible. We need policy advocates and experts to develop solutions. That can be very hard. We need political entrepreneurs to frame problems, introduce new policy products, and mobilize the latent sentiment for change. We then need some kind of leader of the coalition to, if we need to get these reforms voted on by the Congress, by the Parliament, we need to string together enough support to make that possible. And they need to establish the conditions that allow rank and file members to vote for this reform. But what we also need to be mindful of is all the strategies and tactics that are used to win the adoption of reform in the first place do not necessarily assure the reform's sustainability going forward. Indeed, some of the very political strategies that are most useful in helping ease the initial adoption of a reform can cause sustainability problems down the road. And this is why reform is such a tricky pickle to deal with, because we face multiple political challenges, getting reforms designed and adopted and implementing them and sustaining them, and we need to be mindful that these are different stages of the game, and we can't always use the same tactics. So, for example, there are at least 3 set of strategies, generic strategies, that we often see advocates of reforms used to try to make the initial adoption of a reform possible. One of them is informational strategies. We're trying to make people aware that there's a problem, right? We need reform. And we can try to get the public, which usually doesn't pay a lot of attention to every specific policy issue, somehow aware that, yes, this is very important, we need public support for this reform. Maybe we can use symbols or link this narrow reform cause to some broader issue. The problem is that those informational strategies often have a short shelf life. They don't often work very long. Maybe the media might be our friend when we are trying to highlight some pathology of government or some narrow group that's profiting at the public's expense, but the media, we know, can be very fickle. They may not stick with this issue after the reform is adopted. And it's very hard to use symbolic politics. It's very hard to paint in a very broad brush when we get into the murky implementation phase. When we're talking about the initial passage of a landmark reform, we can try to paint the reform as a good versus bad issue, or this is good for families, and that's not, we're going backwards if we go the other way. It might even become a salient campaign issue for a candidate. But when we get to the level of details of writing narrow regulations to carry out the reform, very hard to paint those challenges in that symbolic light. Secondly, procedural strategies. At least in the US case, it can be very important to frame the debate in a way that makes it hard for members of Congress not to vote for the reform. And so what we often do to try to build support for the initial passage of reform is we create parliamentary rules that make it very easy for lawmakers to say, yes, up or down, I will vote for this big reform, and make it hard for them to somehow amend the reform or strip it away. And we basically tie their hands a little bit. The Dan Rostenkowskis, the committee chairs, will craft a bill and we'll get a rule approved, and we'll structure the debate on the floor of the House and the Senate that will make the debate on the terms that are most advantageous to the reformers. But after that happens, after the bill has been signed into law, all those lawmakers can submit any old amendment they want. And there might be a narrow interest group that says, we could live with this reform, but we'd like you to pass this one little obscure provision that no one's going to pay any attention to, which of course will have the effect of completely undermining the goal of the reform. What's going to stop that lawmaker whose business is in that district from filing that bill? No one's paying any attention to it. It's too obscure. You can't explain it to the media, can't explain it to the public, and it can undo the entire bill. And thirdly, a key reform strategy oftentimes is compensating the losers. Maybe there's some group that's unhappy with this reform, and so we need to give them some extra benefits or a transition scheme or grandfather something in, and we hope that that will sort of either win their support or at least sort of tame their opposition. And we do that enough to sort of keep down their opposition during the initial reform stage. The problem is there's a commitment problem. After you buy out the losers, and they say, okay, we can live with this bill if you give us these extra benefits, what stops them from the next session coming back and saying, we want triple our benefits, or else we're going to say you're terrible and we're going to finance your opponent. We're going to run against you. We have a lot of money. We have a lot of power. We're well organized. You might be able to rent losers, but can you really buy them in a democracy? That is a problem. Will losers stay bought? And if the government is enacting a transition scheme, we're going to do this, we're going to phase in this reform over 5 years, and we know there'll be some adjustments, can the government really implement that transition scheme? Maybe there's an election in between the adoption of the transition scheme and the final implementation date. What stops the government from saying, okay, we're going to do this over 10 years because we know 15, and before you know it, you've ended up completely eroding your reform. The second stage of reform is the post-enactment stage. Here at this stage, now the reform is passed. Now we think we deserve a pat on the back. We've broken out the champagne, the fizzy. We've all gone out to the good watering holes on Capitol Hill, and we've celebrated our victory. But the reality is we have not won yet. All we have won is the right to fight another day. Because now these reforms must consolidate themselves, which usually takes time. It is rare for a reform to be able to become completely embedded in an instant. And now what must happen is that the old policy system, whatever was the old system that was so problematic and pathological and inefficient and inequitable that we wanted to reform the thing in the first place, we have to somehow destroy that old system. We have to eliminate it. Whoever was responsible for promoting those bad policies, we need to do something about it. We need to uproot that system, and we need to construct a new system in its place. Now, reform outcomes are never completely settled because democracy doesn't end. There's no end date. Nonetheless, and here's the sort of hopeful part, it is indeed possible for reform to become so deeply embedded in institutions, in governance, if you will, and in the adaptations of social actors via policy feedback effects, that its subsequent reversal becomes virtually unthinkable, even if the next parliament always would retain the legal ability to enact another policy that would undo it. So I want to talk some about that. And that is, it's very important then, in thinking about whether a reform has the good probability to stick or not, to look at a couple of things. First of all, we must look at, and here I'm using American vocabulary, shifts in institutions, but again, I think you might think about this as shifts in governance, shifts in governing arrangements. And that's crucial to trace the evolution of institutions both before and after the reform. And we can distinguish among a hierarchy of shifts. Are we assembling a new system of governance? Are we constructing something new? That can be very powerful. We're creating a new agency, a new authority, a new state capacity. Are we disassembling something? Are we destroying something? That too can be very powerful. Or are we just displacing that authority? Maybe there was Bureau A that had some authority over a policy area,